Buenos días a todos. Primero daros las gracias por estar todos aquí en el segundo día después de la noche ágil, ¿no? Esperemos que el resto de gente vaya llegando en breves minutos. Y simplemente comentaros que ahora, después de la keynote, daremos unos pequeños detalles logísticos, aunque adelantaros que hoy todas las sesiones son en el edificio gris de Humanas, ¿de acuerdo? Y que las salas no van a variar como ayer de unas a otras, con lo que tendréis bastante más sencillo los desplazamientos. Pues bueno, para inaugurar un poco este segundo día, tenemos hoy con nosotros a J.B. Reinsberger, que nos ofrecerá hoy la keynote del día. Comentaros que bueno, es un verdadero placer tener a J.B. hoy con nosotros, porque realmente es un referente a nivel mundial y uno de los pioneros del movimiento Agile, con muchísima experiencia, con muchísima experiencia en proyectos como consultoría, ayuda a empresas, ayuda a equipos. Realmente una persona muy dinámica y que aporta muchísimo al sector, con lo que vamos a dejar ya a JB con su presentación y espero que la disfrutéis.
Muchísimas gracias y de este momento yo voy a pasar en inglés. Disculpen. We'll try. These are the saddest words a programmer has ever spoken, and most of us have spoken them more than once. These words are often the preface to months of grueling effort against a deadline we know in our heart we cannot make. At the end, we come up tired, burnt out, beaten, and short. Management hates us. We hate ourselves. Our families don't know us anymore or have fallen by the wayside. The software, if it works at all, is nothing to be proud of. Oh, there have been exceptions. Successful products have been launched this way, and there's a certain pride in having gone through hell and survived it. We have to believe it was worth the effort because the alternative is to believe that we wasted a huge part of our lives. There has to be a better way. Here's one that couldn't possibly happen. How many people recognize the beginning of this document? Right. This is the introduction to the very famous 1970 paper by Winston Royce that introduced us to the waterfall. And like Royce, I'm going to share only my personal views about where Agile software development has gone over the past 10 years, what I call the extreme decade. And like Royce, it's likely that after you leave here today, if anyone talks about this talk at all, they'll get it completely wrong. Okay, I know it's early, but that was a joke. Right? Because a whole bunch of people got Royce's paper wrong, and they think that the waterfall is the way you're supposed to build software instead of, as he said, something that only works on the most straightforward projects. My story begins with these guys. And I haven't really forgiven them yet for the trouble that they've caused me throughout my life so far. I first learned about these guys in the year 2000 when I was working at IBM. And it was actually these guys who wrote the words that I used to start this presentation. The first article that I ever read about extreme programming was the now infamous We'll Try article. It looks a little different now than it did then, but it doesn't make any less sense. It's certainly as relevant today as it was when Ron first wrote these words. And at that time, I was working at IBM, and I was tired. I was tired because every day I would do my work as a programmer, and at the end of the day, I would think, great, that's over. I finished something. I can be happy about it. And I went home. Unfortunately, the next morning, I would have a bunch of emails in my inbox from testers. Testers. They always find a way to get in the way, right? And all those messages were bug reports. So every night I thought I was done, and every morning some tester would remind me that I wasn't. And after this happened for a week, 2 weeks, a month, I actually reached the point where I started to get pains in my chest Because every day I thought that I was getting closer to the end, and every day the finish line moved further away. And I said those magic words, the magic words that have launched 1,000 companies, the magic words that probably make your life miserable like it has made my life miserable. There has to be a better way. And so at that time, Google had not completely dominated the search engine space. So I'm pretty sure that I typed into Alta Vista. Does anyone remember Alta Vista? Right. So I'm pretty sure I typed into Alta Vista how to test Java code. And then I found this really cool new thing called JUnit. This was a way that I could test my own code. And I thought, great, I can find mistakes before the testers do. At least when they tell me there's a problem, it will be a big one. And from there, I found an early draft of the book that these guys wrote in conjunction with Ann Anderson called XP Installed. This was the second ever book on extreme programming, the Pink Book. And this was the book, Kent Beck's book was the one that told you why you had to do extreme programming. And the Pink Book was the one that told you how to do extreme programming. And in there was a description of what we now know as test-driven development. The idea that you write tests first, and then write just enough code to make those tests pass, and then figure out how to make the design better, and you keep doing that until you can't think of anything more to do. Now, this article was the very first article that I put up outside my office for everyone else to read. If you want to annoy everyone at your company, the first step is to start putting articles up outside your office. It's a great way to tell everyone you work with that you're smart and they're stupid. I wish I'd realized that then. But what was really important about this article is that this article describes the very essence, the very fundamental part of what it means to do Agile software development. And really there are only 3 parts that matter. In here, Ron describes the 3 steps to building good software. 1, we need to know what tasks there are to do. 2, we need to estimate how much effort those tasks will require. And then 3, we need some idea how fast we go. And really that was it. And I think that most of the research, the writing, the development, the innovation that's gone on in Agile software development since then really comes back to these 3 ideas. So let's trace the history a little bit. And let's start with knowing what to do. This was my introduction to working with customers. Who recognizes this? So this is fit.c2.com. This is the original description of what became the gold standard, at least for half a decade, of how to understand and explore products with your customer. And I remember the very first time Ward Cunningham talked about this framework, this library. It was at XP Agile Universe 2002 conference. My God, I don't even remember where that was now. Oh, in Lincolnshire, Illinois. That's right. Not that that matters. Let's say Chicago. And it was at a workshop for functional testing, because that's what we called it back then. Functional testing tools. What are people... Everyone knew by that point, even in 2002, everyone knew how to do unit testing. You found the X unit framework for your language, you downloaded it, and you were ready to go. But there were a whole bunch of ideas about how to write tests that allowed you to have confidence that the system worked from end to end. And in 2002, Ward Cunningham came up with this idea. And the way he presented it was really simple. I mean, if you've never listened to an interview with Ward Cunningham, I recommend finding one somewhere on the web. There's a great pragmatic podcast with him, fairly recent, I think in the last year. And just the way he describes ideas is just so calm and relaxed. And it could be the biggest idea in 20 years, and he would act like it was just something he thought of in the shower. No big deal. And he said, I've been playing around with using spreadsheets because I know that business people understand spreadsheets for the most part, right? Most business users, they may not know how to program, but they sure know how to use almost every feature in Excel. At least the good ones do. And so I thought it would be neat if we could write tests that would look like spreadsheets, and that way the customers would be able to write the tests with us. And then they just push a button and some of the cells would go red and some of the cells would go green, and that would be the way that they would know how much progress we'd made. The more green cells, the more likely that we were getting closer and closer to their goal. It seemed really simple. But Ward, of course, always adds the little twist to an idea that sometimes people forget. And he said, I've used this a little bit with a couple of customers, and I noticed that if you zoom way out and you just look at the pattern of the red and green cells, then you can actually see patterns in the errors that we make, patterns in the stuff that's left to do. You can see the difference between mistakes that just happen and systematic mistakes, the kind of mistakes that we make over and over and over again. He said, so this is a really neat idea. I'm not sure if it's going to go anywhere, but I've been trying it for a while and it seems to work. And pretty much everyone at the workshop just sat there like this. And as we now know, FIT started to revolutionize the way that we talk with customers and the way that we explore products. And every technique that we have now for writing tests with customers or that customers can understand has its beginnings here. This is how I learned how to write stories. In fact, the technique, the card, of course, is something that we've all seen a million times before. And in fact, I'm guessing that a bunch of you have index cards in your pocket right now. And if you don't, shame on you. You should. But it's the actual format of the story that I guess everyone's familiar with by now. So we all know the as a role, I want to feature so that benefit. We all know this one, right? Okay, some do. This really hasn't changed that much in 10 years. Now, there are some people who will tell you that this is a bad idea. You could go online now and you could find articles that are the considered harmful version for this, right? I think one of the things that they completely miss, one of the reasons why I actually like this format, is not because I want all stories to be written this way, but because this is a tremendous way to learn the very fundamentals of how to write good stories. This is how we, those of us who have the gray beards, who have been doing this stuff for 10 years, 15 years, this is how we learned. Now, I don't write my stories in the format as a blah, 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 I want to blah, 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 so that blah, blah, blah. I don't do this anymore except when I'm working with clients. But that's not because I think this is a bad idea. It's because this is a way to learn. This is a starting point. This is what I would call a novice rule. This is something that you would start learning to help you focus on the three most important parts of any story. Who cares? What do they care about? And why? And after doing this for a year, 2 years, 5 years, you'll end up with whatever format makes you happy. In fact, but there's a reason why this format has survived as long as it did. Not only is this known as the Connextra story format, because Connextra was the first company that wrote about this, but there's a reason Mike Cohn includes it in his books. There's a reason why today, probably in most certified Scrum Master courses, or certified Scrum Product Owner courses, not intended as an endorsement, that you'll still see this today. It's not because this is the best way to write a story. It's because this is a really good way to learn how to write a story. And then in 2005, I believe, was the first time I saw this paper. Has anyone else read this? Programmers especially? Right, so in 2005, there was this very strange argument going on inside the community. We had been saying for years, test-driven development is not about testing, it's about design. And there were a bunch of people who decided that they wanted to take this idea really seriously. And they started writing about how can we change test-driven development so that people will not think about testing, that they'll think about design instead. And Dave Estells, yet another Canadian, by the way, Thank you. That actually was a whole bunch of making jokes about Canadians last month in Kiev. So I just, as a reflex now, without thinking, I'm pointing out every Canadian. Dave Estelles was the one who wrote this article who said, what if we stopped calling them tests? What if we started saying something like, should? The software should do this. The software should do that. You know, the shopping cart should, or when the shopping cart is empty, then we should display a message saying the shopping cart is empty. And the idea was to try to move in the direction away from tests towards specifications. In fact, the very first framework that they wrote in Ruby used the term specify and context instead of test class and test. Now, at the time, I felt a bit jealous of Dave, and so, because this actually, somewhere in the back of my brain, I knew this was a good idea. But at the time I thought, here's just another consultant who is very selfishly and very cynically branding an old idea with a new name to make more money. I thought, at the time I wrote the world's shortest article on behavior-driven development. I can say the whole article, it's that short. BDD is TDD done well. And that's what I thought at the time. But I've learned since that behavior-driven development is more than that. That yes, it includes doing test-driven development well, but it also includes things like feature injection, setting up, using test-driven development as a pull system for features. In fact, making it more likely that we spend less energy writing more stories than we're ever going to invent, or we're ever going to implement. And this, of course, at the time was based on something called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. The name isn't important, but the idea is the language we speak drastically affects the thoughts we can have. Because, of course, when we express thoughts, even in our own minds, we tend to express them through language. And so what you think of will be very different whether you're thinking in English, in Spanish, in Russian, in Mandarin. That certain aspects of the language affect the thoughts we can have. And so that was one of the basic ideas behind behavior-driven development, was if we use words that don't say test, then maybe we won't think about tests. And of course, before I really understood what behavior-driven development was about, I figured nobody will be talking about this in 2 or 3 years. Except that I'm pretty sure this is how we all write stories or acceptance tests now. Right? If you don't use Cucumber, you use some version of it, Cuc for Duke, Cuc for Nuke, JBehave, whatever language you're working in now, this has pretty much become the standard for the way that we write stories, the way that we write scenario tests. In fact, the words have changed. Now we're moving back towards use case language. But as I said, it's this guy, Chris Matz, who really helped me understand what BDD was all about. That BDD is a way of, as I said, using test-driven development to set up a pull system for features. It helps us avoid wasting time writing more stories and writing more scenario tests or acceptance tests than we need. And these ideas really do little more than apply the principles of lean software development to writing stories. And of course, since then, a bunch more important ideas that affect the work that we do, which tasks we perform, and the way we perform them. We've seen them over the years. Object Mentor, when I was working with them for a few years, several years ago, I learned about this stuff called the 3 values of software. They had written the 2 values of software, that there are features, and of course we sell the features to people, and features are valuable. I sell you features, you give me money, everyone's happy. But the second value of software is a simple design. Because the goal of a simple design is not just some artistic craftsman kind of goal, but it's a very practical goal that the simpler the design, the cheaper it is to build new features. And in fact, not only does it make building new features cheaper, but when we decide to build a feature, mostly doesn't matter. If we build it next week, it costs pretty much the same as if we build it 6 months from now. That's part of the idea of keeping the design simple. And since then, I've added the third value of software, which is feedback from a customer. The magic phrase is, "That's not what I meant." You want your customers to say, "That's not what I meant," as soon and as often as you can. The sooner and more often you hear that phrase, the more you know that you're getting important information that allows you to build the product they need. And so also at the same time, we have the domain-driven design community. Eric Evans led the way with his book, Domain-Driven Design, tackling the heart of complexity in software. We have the Specification by Example book, which was essentially the culmination of 10 years of ideas that started with Ward Cunningham's FIT framework. And Gojko Adzik has written this wonderful book and does great training that talks about this. But it's Mary Poppendieck that I want to talk about briefly, because about 3.5 years ago at a conference in the US, Mary said one thing that really, really stuck with me. It had to do with the relationship between programmers and business people. And I say programmers, really I mean programmers and testers and all the technical people involved in delivering software, but usually it's just easier to say programmers as a shorthand. And we had spent a long time, all the way going back to Kent Beck's first book, in saying we need an on-site customer, we need the business to be involved in the software building system. We need customers who are comfortable walking in and talking with programmers and talking with testers. We need customers who are comfortable coming into the room where we're building the software and working with us to write tests. And Mary said that we'd got this all wrong. That really we need to do it the other way around. That it's time for the programmers to be willing to go to the business. And this, to me, again, is not only is this a significant idea that, in part, I wouldn't say has led to, but coincides with the lean startup movement and this entrepreneurial spirit that there is now among programmers that there wasn't 10 years ago, or at least wasn't as strong. But the big thing is that, again, this is about taking the fundamental ideas of lean software, of extreme programming, and applying it to itself. What's the quickest way for us to get a good result as a programmer? We need to understand the business. What's the easiest way for us to understand the business? We need to go there. For the Japanese junkies in the house, the business is our gemba. That's where we need to go to really see where the work is done. So all these have been very influential ideas in the way that we build Agile, the way that we build software using Agile methods, but really they all have their basis in figuring out what it is that we need to do. How many people have read this article before? Anyone? So now I'm getting to learn who the old people are, so I think that's really good. This was the very first, if you downloaded JUnit 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, this was the only article available on how to write tests. This was really it. It wasn't until about 2003, 2004 that the books started to come out. And so this was the simple introduction to writing tests. This is how I learned to write tests. And really, nothing has changed. That's why you still get this article when you download JUnit. In fact, I wish it was part of every XUnit download. Now, a couple of years after that, we had this really simple idea, which I think applies to much more than just writing tests and doing test-driven development. This idea of a test list, that as I'm writing software, I have a little note card next to my computer, and the first thing I do is write down the list of tests that I think I might need. Then when I've written that list down, I start programming, and as the tests pass, I cross them off. And as I think of new tests, I write them down, and that way they're out of my head, and I keep going. And to me, the really important idea here is to be able to get things out of your head so that they won't bother you. You can focus while you're trying to do work. And if a thought pops into your head that is not exactly what you're working on right now, write it down and get it out of your head. Now, this was a technique that Kent Beck described in his book on test-driven development, but it really is an idea that we now see in getting things done. The idea of not having an open loop, Don't let anything distract you. If a thought pops into your head and that thought is not something you'll use right now to do work, write it down, forget about it, then focus. So even something as big as getting things done, a technique that is transforming the way everyone does work, not just in software, again, something a little bit that has its roots in our community. And so this is the way I manage projects now. This is my project management system. This is OmniFocus. This is a getting things done software package, but it allows me to do all the basic things that I need to be able to keep track of what it is that needs to be done. And I started teaching these techniques in a new course called Free Your Mind to Do Great Work that has as part of its idea how to essentially allow your mind to focus on the very next thing you need to do. All of this, all simply has to do with figuring out what are the tasks that we need to perform in order to get our project done. So this, if I remember correctly, was the third or fourth book on extreme programming. This is by Kent Beck and Martin Fowler, Planning Extreme Programming. This, I think, was in reaction to everyone who said extreme programming meant no plans. And of course, that's nonsense. What extreme programming meant was plan every 3 weeks. Back then we had 3-week iterations. I still don't know why. I guess that's just because the first team thought 3 weeks was nice. But 3 weeks is just strange for everyone. It doesn't coincide with, well, I guess it's 4 iterations in a quarter. It's not so bad. Make sure we have a week off. But at any rate, this was the book that was meant to answer the question, where is planning in extreme programming? And this is where we learned about releases and iterations and story points and ideal days. And God, does anyone remember load factor and velocity and all these things? And for a long time, I really tried to apply these ideas because the book said, over time, your estimates should converge to this nice narrow range where you might not be accurate, but at least you're some constant multiple of the truth. So the idea is that if you estimate long enough, then eventually every story that you estimate your estimate will be, twice as big or 3 times as big the actual cost. And I kept looking for systematic error to fade into the background. And I really wanted this stuff to work. I did. And estimates really did help me at the very beginning of the work that I did. And I wanted to build on the experience of using this technique of estimating. But I remember, again, going back to my experience at IBM, and when I'd risen to the level of a technical lead, that was the first time that I had to deal with the game. And the game is played like this. We need some estimates from you. When is this stuff going to be done? I really don't know. I'm not even really clear on what we're supposed to do. Well, give me some kind of estimate, something. Now, I had just read the book Rapid Development, and one of the things they said was, if someone asks you for an estimate, the answer is always, I don't know, I'll get back to you. I'll tell you later. You never give someone an estimate when they ask you for it. You tell them you need to think about it, and you'll give them an answer later. And maybe they'll never ask you again. And so my manager at the time said, look, I don't care what the numbers are, and I don't care how accurate they are, and I don't care how correct they are. My boss needs me to give him numbers, so I need you to give me numbers. Just give us some. So that's when I learned what the magic estimate for everything is. 12. 2 parts of that estimate are very important. One, the bad French accent is actually a key part. It's not 12, it's 12. The second thing, no unit of measure. Not 12 weeks, not 12 months, not 12 days, not 12 hours, just 12. To emphasize the fact that these estimates are by and large meaningless. In fact, when I worked on my very first XP project at Toyota, we were so concerned about making sure that XP was going to work well because we wanted companies in Toronto to embrace XP so that we would have more jobs to go to once we left that one. And we were working so hard to make XP look good, to make this, the method, the techniques so perfect, that we forgot to build the product and instead focused on making the numbers look good. I can remember being in a meeting there were three of us. They called us the Big Three. We were the three people who knew more about XP than anyone else in Toronto, which meant everyone in Toronto knew this much, and we knew this much. And at one point, and I will never stop being ashamed of this, we actually looked at each other and very seriously said, well, if we just multiply all the estimates by 5, it'll look like we did a lot of work. And this was our way to try to make XP a success. So this was kind of when I started to learn that there was something about estimates that weren't quite right. And this is one of those cases. The only thing better than a good presentation is a presentation with one serious flaw that you can complain about. So I apologize to Mike Bowler for not finding a picture of him, but this was the guy who really gave me the big break. And we had really been trying to focus on making estimates work, figuring out how to build these beautiful iteration plans, and then this happened.
This part right here. This thing here.
Okay, this is a blackboard.
Okay.
Everything starts like this.
Okay.
You just got the MMF, nothing else. And as information comes up about the MMF, a new requirement or a new whatever else, whenever you got one new thing, you just put up one card for that new thing. And if a piece of information requires an action, then as soon as that action is complete, you cross it off and put it at the bottom. When all of them that require action are complete, you check to see whether the MMF is done with the customer.
So the items might be things like, a new database needs to be installed on this machine, or it could be like some sort of spike.
It could be a spike. Please answer this question. Right. It could be this class. I need to rename a couple of methods because they suck. It could be do a JavaScript animation of this particular dropdown.
This is for the team.
It's purely for the team. The team just uses that to keep notes and communicate amongst itself. The customer, all they see are these cards go up, the cards go over here. When we declare one done, they look at it, and if they don't think it's done, we just put more information up here. And then eventually it gets done.
So it just stays.
Yeah.
It stays until
a customer says we agree it's done, and the last item up here is always remove the scaffolding. So that's when we remove it from unfinished work, and now it's live. If there's going to be, as soon as the next rollout is, it'll go live.
Okay, explain urgent.
Urgent. So urgent, you're allowed exactly one urgent item. You try and keep urgent always empty, but it exists purely because there will be a support call. It'll be from an important customer, and it will need to bypass the queue and all work currently in flight. And so they can put one item into urgent. The second urgent item has to go into the queue.
And now, why 7?
Okay, why 7? 7's the magic number. It's how many things a person can keep in their mind at once and prioritize. And so that is the number that ensures that the customers are actually making valid prioritization decisions at all times.
Okay. And how they map to goals?
So goals you generate in advance. They meet some total business objective. So whatever is necessary to completely satisfy this portion of a contract, or maybe this whole, this phase or whatever, or whatever else it is. And so whenever there is a gap in the 7-item queue, something has been eaten by development, then the customers create at that time and not before one new MMF card. And it either can come from a bug that's known in the system that's a single item, or it can be one step towards one of these goals.
And MMF is?
MMF, minimal marketable feature, smallest thing that your customers think they can sell.
Excellent. Thank you, Arlo.
Yep.
I like to include this because this is like an English fluency test. If you understood what Arlo said, then you speak fluent English, or at least hear fluent English. I can't imagine going back and doing iteration planning and estimating tasks, 2 or 3 iterations in advance. now that we have this. And of course, this at the time Arlo called naked planning, which really is just taking, again, the basic principles of lean and applying them to the way that we plan software releases and software projects. And of course, eventually, this became Kanban. This is what we know as Kanban. The two, at the time, I think Arlo called it naked planning because nobody had introduced him to the concept of Kanban. And they both sort of entered the Agile software community at the same time. And now, of course, it's become very, very fashionable to make sure that no matter what you do in an Agile project, that you have a Kanban board somewhere. I actually started doing this in my training classes, and I have to admit that for something that I think a lot of people treat as a marketing gimmick, wrongly. I mean, it's much more than that. But this is one of those techniques that sort of everyone does now because it's a fancy buzzword and people kind of think that, oh, well, if I'm going to be Agile, I have to do something with Kanban because, you know, that Scrum stuff is old by now. But I have to say that it really does work. I've used this for myself in managing the way that I sell my services to customers, and it's really been fantastic. And it doesn't really matter whether we work in iterations or we work with this kind of flow of work. Again, what's important is having some idea how long it takes to do things. Now, this is a diagram from a process, a generic process. Somewhere in the middle of a big, long process, we have two activities. B comes after A. But unfortunately, some percentage of the time, let's say 20% of the time, we have to, after we start doing B, we recognize that we have to go back and do some more of A. And it turns out, by applying some concepts from systems thinking and queuing theory, that in order to avoid this, in order to make this loop more predictable, because of course, we don't know how many times we'll have to go through this loop. It could be once, it could be 10 times, it could be 100 times, and that's the problem. If we did a little bit of the second process first and then a little bit of the first process, and we did this in really small cycles, the throughput through this part of the process will be higher on average than the throughput through here. Now, we can use this idea to help us turn the waterfall into something better. And of course, this is an area where the diagrams somehow didn't end up in here. Well, let's take a look at coding and testing. So in a typical waterfall project, testing follows coding. Well, I don't know about you, but I've worked on projects where as people are doing some testing, they find out that we have to change part of the code. We call those bugs, right? And so we have no idea how long it will take to get through that part of the system because I'm sure you've experienced it too, where you fix one bug and you create two more, and you fix two bugs and create one more, and the loop just keeps going and going and going. And when does that phase of the project end? When someone decides they don't want to pay for it anymore. Or the simpler answer, December 15th. So what if instead we did a little bit of testing, then a little bit of coding, then a little bit of testing, then a little bit of coding, and we call that test first programming. And then I don't know about you, but I've been on a project where I try to do test first programming. I'm trying to type in this beautiful design that this very smart person sitting on a chair 2 meters high in the corner has drawn. And because, of course, they wouldn't dare write code themselves, right? They're an architect. That's not their job anymore. And as we try to implement their beautiful design, their perfect, exquisite design, it doesn't work. There are parts that don't fit together. There are parts that need to change. And so we have to go back and change the designs. And of course, we go back and change the design documents, right? Right. So what if we wrote a little bit of a test, wrote a little bit of code, and then improved the design? And then wrote another test and wrote a little bit of code and improved the design. And did that in small cycles. The throughput should be higher, no? Well, we call that test-driven development. Now, I don't know about you, but I've worked on projects where even when we're doing beautiful test-driven development, it turns out that we're building the wrong thing. And so we end up having to go back and change our ideas about what the requirements are. What do the requirements mean? Which ones need to be done first? Well, what if we wrote a test, wrote some code to make it pass, improved the design, and then took that information and looped it back into our understanding of the requirements? And what if we showed it to a customer so that they could say the magic phrase, "That's not what I wanted"? This is behavior-driven development. This is feature injection. This is exactly what Chris Matz was writing about. And I don't know about you, but I've worked on projects where even if we did all of that really well, when we're ready to push something into production, it takes 3 weeks. Or in the case of one customer, 18 months. That's a real number. So, what if instead we deployed an empty application, then wrote a test, wrote a little bit of code, improved the design, checked to make sure that we're writing the right thing, and put that into production? And we call that continuous deployment. I don't know about you. I promise this is the last one. I don't know about you. But I've worked on projects where we've done all of that really well. And then in the live site, when we popped up Google Analytics, we found out that we got 3 hits last month. What if we put something out there that works just a tiny bit, told people about it, and gave them an opportunity to use it? And maybe even asked them if they'd be willing to give us a credit card number. And then use that to figure out whether we need to build the next part, and the next part, and the next part. And that's called lean startup, right? Learn, measure, build instead of build, measure, learn. Figure out what it is that the world might want. Figure out how you're going to measure how much of it they want, usually by how much money they'll give you and how long they will keep giving it to you. And then build the thing they're looking for. So even the lean startup, which has become a really big phase or a really big fad these days, is really nothing more than taking some old ideas from this book. The ideas of figuring out what it is that you need in order to be successful, and then figuring out how to build just that much stuff. Don't control expenses if you can build wealth-generating assets. Well, in a typical project, in a typical corporate environment, all we do is focus on cost. But in the lean startup, what we're concerned with value. In fact, we're concerned with the flow of value. And specifically, we're concerned with the flow of other people's money into our pockets. These are not new ideas. This is just, again, taking the basic fundamental ideas from lean development and applying them even to Agile software. Applying them even, it's like it's XP applied to itself. So it's really no surprise that this guy is very big now in the lean startup community. If you wonder why you haven't heard much from Kent Beck lately, it's because he's too busy trying to run lean startups. So he certainly recognizes that this is just the next obvious step in Agile software development. That really we've gone from using the ideas in Lean and Extreme to help us write better software to using the ideas from Lean and Extreme to help us build better businesses. And that's all related to figuring out how much effort goes into something, how much effort we should put into doing work. And then the last part, which is about knowing how quickly we go. How fast are we? What's our velocity? How many people have read this book? Your homework after this session is to go and buy a copy of this book, then read it. It is, when people ask, I know that Yves Anul asked last year at the Agile conference for everyone to write down the most influential book for them that has to do with Agile software development. And this was it for me. I read this book when I was in graduate school, so I see there are a bunch of you opening up your laptops, ordering it on Kindle now. Some of you are taking photos of it. I'm sorry I don't have the QR code. I'm not that advanced yet. That's what the young kids do. I haven't figured that out yet. The psychology of computer programming teaches us a lot of things, but the most important thing that it teaches us is that we have no idea what makes teams productive. We don't know. It's such a complicated, actually a complex system, that the most we can possibly do is try something and see whether it works. And then try something, then see whether it works. Jürgen Apollo, in his book Management 3.0, uses this as the basic principle throughout his entire book. I don't remember who exactly he took the quote from, But you can't understand a complex system. You can only dance with it. Try to move here and see if it will move with you. Try to move here and see if it will move with you. So really, we have no idea what it takes for teams to be productive. But we have learned some things about how teams work well. This is one. I first learned about osmotic communication about 8 years ago. The metaphor was that information flows like air. And we know that we get better results when we allow information to flow freely through the team, to flow freely through the organization. In fact, this is the basis of this book, written by this guy. See, this joke works better when you're with Canadians. Okay, it's really this guy, Alistair Coburn. Here's another idea based on convection flows of information, allowing information to flow freely. In fact, again, from Arlo Belshi. Again, how many people have read this paper? More homework. If we're going to be in a university, then I'm going to assign homework. Sorry. I didn't choose to have the conference here. The idea here was simply that these guys experimented with how often to switch pairs and found out that for them, 4 times a day worked well. But that wasn't the surprising part. The surprising part was, at the end of a pairing session, you have to decide which person's going to leave. And is it the person who knows more about the system, the part that they're working on, or the one who knows less that should leave? It turns out that it's the person who knows more about that part of the system who should leave. It's the idea of the least qualified implementer. The idea is if you are forced to learn more about that part of the system, and if you're always forced to learn more every time you work on part of the system, that is part of what makes information flow most quickly through the entire team. In fact, we say that learning is the bottleneck in any new product development. And everything we do in software is new product development. So it turns out that we make the system go quickest when we encourage people to learn the most, even though that's painful. And this Code Retreat has become one of the biggest success stories in encouraging people to focus on learning. How many people here have been to a Code Retreat? So it's crazy, right? Programmers get together at 8:30 in the morning on a Saturday. They spend the entire day working in pairs. They work on this simple, stupid problem whose specification is this big for 45 minutes. And at the end of 45 minutes, we delete the code, switch pairs, and do it again. And that's what we do for an entire day. It sounds nuts, but it is a way to really accelerate learning, especially when around 11:30 in the morning, just when you're starting to think about lunch, somebody says, okay, do it again and don't use any if statements. Do it again and don't use arrays. Do it again and you can't use a loop. Do it again in a language you've never programmed in before. So this really is an extreme application of the idea that learning is the bottleneck in software development. This is another very influential paper. This was written at a time when everything written about continuous integration focused on the tools. Cruise control was very popular. In fact, cruise control was really all we had at the time. Again, I'm showing my gray. But the problem was that Jim had noticed this strange anti-pattern happening in teams. That where I would work on something, I would check in all my changes, and then I would walk away. I believe this is now, in this conference, we know that as commit and run. And so nobody else was at that session? Is this on? Okay. That's known as commit, then run, right? The idea that this thing out there that's building the software every 30 minutes or every hour will tell me if I got it right. That's not continuous integration, my friends. That's commit, then run. Continuous integration is not a set of tools. It's the idea that we work on a very small piece of the system for a very short period of time, maybe an hour, maybe half an hour, maybe 2 hours if we have a lot to do, and we integrate that back with the system on our machine. We make sure it works. Then we go to another machine and we check it all out and we make sure it still works, and then we can say to the team, everything's cool, just to let you know, you should update soon. Not hoping that somebody will react to a broken build, because I know that what will happen there is what I've seen happen over and over again. The build breaks the first time, a couple of people go, oh my God, the build's broken, and they go fix it. When that happens for the 5th time in 2 weeks, the reaction is more like this. Sebastian, go fix the build. I'm pretty sure it was you. After a while, we simply don't fix the build anymore. So this is an area where we need to be a little bit more extreme about how we practice and to be more careful about the way that we practice. And now we have ideas like this, the idea of deploying 50 times a day. I don't think you can get much more extreme than this, except apparently you can. What you can do instead is let the programmers, because they have so much experience, they've spent years working together, they've spent years working in the same domain, they've spent years working with the same customer, give them free run of the whole thing. All their projects are 2 days long. They put stuff into production, they let users try it, and if there's a problem, they just pull it out of production and try to fix it. These guys are so extreme, they don't even write tests anymore. They don't need to. If you're going to build it and throw it away in 3 hours, why do you need tests? If you've built a system where the cost of failure is so low that you can afford to just put it in production, hope it works, and let people try it, and pull it out if it doesn't, why do you need tests? Again, this is just applications of the extreme ideas on themselves. In fact, the single most important idea in our field is one that a bunch of you probably don't even realize you know. So how many people have read this book? Last piece of homework. This is the theory behind everything we do. The theory of constraints. The idea that every system has a bottleneck, and our job is to try to move the bottleneck around to make the whole system faster. The idea that if we increase the flow of value but keep costs the same or lower, then we're taking a step towards doing the right thing. This is now the way I coach teams. We don't have to have arguments about which practice should we try next. We don't have to have arguments about whether we should do all of XP or just these parts, or let's just try Scrum. The bottleneck tells us which problem to solve next. And all the books on Lean, Agile, Scrum, XP, Kanban, FDD, DSDM, Crystal Clear, all of them with all their nice tricks, we just pick the trick that helps us move in the direction of getting rid of that bottleneck and try to move the bottleneck to some other part of the system. And so now coaching teams in terms of figuring out what to try next is now the easy part. Of course, the hard part is convincing them to do it. And for that reason, I think that even though I am running a bit short on time, I would like to spend at least a few seconds to observe a moment of silence for Ellie Goldratt, who died earlier this year. Thank you. So this talk is entitled The Extreme Decade, Progress, Pain, and Paradox, and I wanted to provide you a paradox. And let's see if I can do it in 3 minutes. There's a whole bunch of people talking about what happens after Agile software development, the so-called post-Agile. And the idea behind post-Agile is we've screwed up the word Agile. We've made it too commercial. We've made it too superficial. Agile has gone into the mainstream because it's now a buzzword. Agile is what companies want to do even though they don't know why, even though they don't know what it means, even though they don't know the consequences. Now, not all clients are like that, but many are. Their golfing buddy says, we're doing Agile, and so they think they have to do Agile. And then we get into really stupid arguments about whether we mean Agile or Agile. And I really don't want to get into this argument about, well, no, Agile is perfectly fine. It's Agile that's been completely screwed up. The word is the problem, but the concepts are still there. And so if you say that post-Agile is really just Agile, it's true that there's really no post-Agile, but there is a post-Agile. Confused yet? So am I. And then I read this wonderful article by Paul Pagel of Eighth Light, a guy who I remember when he was just a little intern at Object Mentor, and now he's all grown up. And he's written about, let us discuss what Agile is missing. Let's put it under the microscope. Let's get our brightest and most energetic minds to solve its problems. Let's call Agile dead, only to create the drama needed to investigate intelligently how we need to expand, how we need to explore what it really means to be Agile. And I'm pretty sure I know this post-Agile thing. I've actually found this post-Agile magic thing that everyone's been looking for. Would you like to know what it is? These guys do it. And if these guys do it, it must be good because they're pretty smart. These guys do it. And I know these guys are really smart. So if they do it, it must be really good. Would you like to know what it is? This is the post-Agile everyone's been looking for. We already got it. Now, actually, it does say here in my notes, pause, I hope, for applause. And I at least got one guy clapping. So thanks very much, Enrique, for that. I think the fact that you guys didn't applaud kind of makes my point a little bit more. That the new ideas that are going to catapult us into the next decade, that are going to make us really be successful in the years to come, are the old ideas. It's the fundamentals of applying the ideas of extreme programming to itself. The one thing people complain about with Agile is that we're not Agile about being Agile. Well, guess what? We are. All the ideas that I've talked about for the last hour are the result of taking extreme ideas and treating them extremely, finding out the fundamental part that works and doing just that. Kanban is lean iterations. They're extreme iterations. Lean startup is extreme business strategy. It's all got its roots in the same place. The arguments we have about what we should be doing, we're all doing the same thing. I think somehow we just don't recognize it. Bill Caputo is an example of a guy who was in the extreme programming community 10 years ago, and I'm guessing that 3 of you at the most know who this is. And that's a shame. But what Bill's doing is living in an organization where he gets to do real extreme programming. Not by the book, but by the spirit of what it means to do the least possible and still do great things. And he says it well. XP ain't out there, it's in here. It's a mindset, it's an attitude. It's about figuring out there's got to be a better way we can do less in order to do more. So where is it all going to go? What's going to happen now as we exit the extreme decade and move into the next decade? I don't know what to call it. Unfortunately, here's one scenario. what we've been looking for, this thing that we're going to do next, the development of Agile software development, we've already been there, we've already have it, it's already here. Let's not blow it up together. Gracias.
Gracias. Tenemos tiempo para un par de preguntas. Las personas que quieran hacerlas, si quieren dirigirse en inglés, pueden hacerlo, y si no, pues le trasladaremos.
Hi. How do you suggest to introduce TD into large project with a lot of lines of code?
Unfortunately, the acoustics are not that good here. I didn't hear any of that. That was an intake problem. What? I don't know. ¿Puede repetir?
I said, how would you suggest to introduce TDD into a large project with a lot of lines of code? Okay,
so for introducing any practice to a large organization, the most important thing for me is to remember that at the very beginning, the only people who should do it are the ones who want to do it. Find the ones who are already interested, the ones who will volunteer, the ones who will be interested to get training, the ones who will be interested to do the experiments, and find a way to put those people together. If you really want any practice to grow and spread through the organization, you have to rely on people's willingness, their natural interest to do it. If you try to force them, they won't learn anything. And what we need is for those people to learn. And most of the thing that motivates us to learn is when we are given an opportunity to do something interesting, a little bit of a challenge, but not too hard. And if we can be around other people who want to do the same thing, so I don't have to feel alone. It will take time, maybe it will take years, but I can tell you from direct experience that if we try to make everyone do it, 10 people will do it well, then they will quit, and nothing else will change. He's here because of that. I'm pointing to Sebastian Hermida. He's here because an organization tried to make everyone do something. And it might take 2 years, it might take 5 years, but the best people will quit. So instead, find the ones who are interested, give them the chance, give them a challenge, and put them together, and wait. And it will grow this way.
Hi. I must admit I have a problem when, after an hour of a talk, everything boils down to attitude. Could you please, add something to what objective truth could we have apart from that, which is pretty generic?
I understand your frustration, and I agree. I talked about the book Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and the first time I read that book, every second page said, there's no one way to achieve this. You have 2 basic principles and you just have to follow them. If I knew how to do that, already I would be rich. So to look for something objective, I think, and it relates to the previous question, most people will only learn something or change their behavior when there's a clear benefit or a clear win for them. So there's a wonderful book called The New Strategic Selling. And the basic idea here is, if you can figure out what that one person really cares about and what will make them feel like they win, and if you can sell that to them, it's easy. I first started doing test-first programming because I was arguing with testers, and because every night I went home, I thought I was finished. Every morning, they would say no. And again, I started to feel anxiety. I started to feel stress because I would never be finished. So that's the point where I started to ask the question, what can I do differently? What can I do more? I think it's true of everyone in this room. If you think about why you are here, probably in your career at some point, you reached this point of stress where you needed to change what you're doing, or you couldn't keep going the old way anymore. So that, I think, is some people might think of that as a bad thing. That, we shouldn't wait so long to change the way we do things, that we should be prepared to make changes before the problems come. But I think it's more natural for us to listen very carefully to ourselves, to our minds, to our bodies, to what's causing us stress, and then fix those problems before the stress becomes too bad. Certainly we don't want the stress to be so bad that we have a heart attack and die. It's enough to feel the stress for 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and then say, there must be a better way. So I would say that remember what caused you to change the way you work, the way you program, the way you test, the way you plan projects. And look for that in other people. Find out for them what really is important to them, and then share with them the ideas that could fix those problems. I like to say that these practices, it's not like levels of a video game where you just keep going one after the other and you try to conquer each level. At a moment where you have a specific problem, I have a bag with 200 solutions. Let's find the solution that matches your problem. At that moment, you will be ready to try. And to me, that's the most important thing, is to be there when someone has a real problem and offer them a potential solution, instead of pushing every solution at them and hoping that they do it. So that's about the only objective thing, is people will not change until they really feel like they need it. So don't push them.
Pues muchas gracias por esta excelente charla.
Gracias por la oportunidad.